Live. I'm so excited to dive into another pre-symposium panel. A pre-symposium panel is a lead up to our executive symposium in Houston on October 7th, where we're here to discuss people-centric growth aligning purpose, leadership, and profit. We've got three great leaders who are going to be at our executive symposium on October 7th, sharing with us their thoughts on this topic. We've got Suzanne, we've got Dan, we've got Michael. Suzanne, do you mind introducing yourself?
Yeah, happy to. So Suzanne Frawley, Director of Talent Management for JV Poindexter and Company. And I'll say I reinforce and drive across the enterprise, which is across North America, uh, 9 subsidiaries, and we're located here in Houston, Texas. I have everything from succession planning, leadership development, performance management, engagement, leading change, and coaching.
Very nice. Dan, how about you?
Yeah, Dan Durkin, Yes Prep Public Schools, leading education done right, representing 22,000 students in the Houston area and 2,700 staff, number one for education of getting kids into college in the Houston area. Proud to be here.
Very cool. And then Michael, how about you?
Hello, and thank you for having me. I'm the founder of InfoSec Labs. We've been around for 30 years. We are actually the original security advisory firm. When we founded the company and we said we do security, people would say, "What's that?" So what we do is we do strategic security, which is VCSO work. We do tactical security, which is help selecting and deploying tools. And we do technical security, which is helping companies get to where they need to be by properly deploying and configuring the tools they buy.
Very nice. And I'm Garrett Mintz. I'm the founder and CEO of Ambition in Motion. And Ambition in Motion, our vision is a world where the vast majority of people are excited to go to work. When they are there, their expectations meet reality. And when they come home, they feel fulfilled. And we believe that starts with leaders because leaders create the experiences employees have while at work. And so we create technologies and communities to empower leaders to be their best selves for their teams. And one of the ways that we build communities through Executive Symposium. So let's dive in. Topic is people-centric growth, aligning purpose, leadership, and profit. We've gone through this very interesting economic cycle. I mean, I think I can recall back to, 2021 when it was very much an employee market and it was just this war for talent and everyone was like, if you had a pulse, you got a major salary offer for doing a job that, in 2022, 2023, 2024 likely got laid off. And so we're in this marketplace now in 2025 where it definitely seems more of an employer market. It seems like the pendulum has switched. And so when we talk about people-centric growth, aligning purpose, leadership, and profit, there's this balancing act of both the profit of the organization, but also the empowering of the people. And so I guess what I would be curious is from a strategic perspective, how do you balance like the needs from an economic perspective of what's going on in the world? What are what are the workplace trends? What are things going on? How do you balance that with the need to create an environment where people can thrive and grow, and the business can still be profitable? Like, I guess maybe another way of putting the question is when you see maybe an opportunity to shave off a couple of expenses here and there, where do you decide like, hey, maybe we shouldn't shave off that because that could potentially be detrimental to the culture of the organization. How do you go about strategically determining that? So that's where I'll start off with the questions. Who wants to go first?
Well, I'll be happy to go first. Um, Strategically determining um, the size of the staff, and in particular the security staff in my case, has to do with a long view. So it can't be driven by quarterly P&L considerations. It is often driven by that, but I try to talk with leadership and tell them what the upsides and downsides are of eliminating various positions. It's not always an easy discussion. In fact, it's never an easy discussion because these days, um, as you put it so well, the life of the employee is in the hands of the company, at least the professional life, and the idea of a company saying, "Well, we'll bite the bullet and keep this person even though he's too expensive or we don't think we need him." That's a losing proposition.
Who wants to go next?
You know, and you can see some of my whiteboard behind me, but I have a graphic that talks about, you know, there's the star model when you talk about an organization, and it refers to the strategy and the culture and the resources, and and what I've done is I've created my own, and I put people in the middle, because the resources and the strategy and your processes and your systems won't happen without people. And I love, Mike, what you said regarding, you know, you've got to take the long view, because for our business, we are in a downturn right now. It is a tough market. And really, what happens when it starts to come back and you have to ramp back up? And you don't want to lose that talent. You want to make sure you've got that talent, but how can you continue to encourage them, you know, in a down market? And how do you encourage them to continue to grow their skills and up their skills? And, you know, when you bring out, for example, like career paths and maps, and you're just having that career conversation and that skills conversation with them, that certainly helps to, you know, restore morale, and that this, you know, the ship is not going down. But unfortunately, I do see that it's easy for organizations to cut heads. And what I think a lot of organizations miss is that when those people leave, they talk, and they talk about their experience, and it makes it a lot harder for that organization to recruit, because people, they don't want to work there because of how others were treated.
If you don't mind my jumping in, Dan, for 1 second before you go, um, Suzanne, you're right. Generally, in a better market, people would be picky and say, "Oh, I don't want to work for this company because of X, Y, and Z." But in this market, if you get a job offer, you take it, and it almost doesn't matter which company it is. There's this thing called blind, and when you go to blind, you read what people say, and they rip companies to shreds. But if somebody said, "Well, would you go back there?" Of course I would. I need a job.
Yeah, taking that, some of the comments already said and drilling it down a little bit. I think when you look at the work, you have to decipher if it's going to be project work or if this is more sustainable work. When it's project work, you can really take your resources from a different angle. That's where you look at the interns coming out of the colleges, the people that want to outsource, the people that want to do it, this way or that way. And that gives you a lot of opportunities on how to manage your costs, especially if your quarterly numbers are bad. Can you move some of your project work into different models to change out how people get paid, right? If the benefits aren't that valuable and you get paid more on a project hour, it might be in their benefit to do project versus getting laid off and not having a job at all, right? So you kind of get to choose your destiny there. A couple other things is around the strategy and the fit. Like, where are you going as an organization? If it's tough times and you're looking to cut costs, then the strategy is, how do we build the team that can weather the storm? Because hopefully we'll come back out of the storm while we reduce these costs. And that's a different team than a team that's going to say, I'm going into growth mode. I want to take over the world. I want to take on a new product. I want to change our products. Those are different teams to build. And when we look at what we want to build from a performance standpoint, I think that's where the fit changes, right? Do you want a bunch of aggressive project manager going to deliver, get ROI? Do you want to weather the storm where you're going to be more resilient? Do you need to have cheaper and more expensive talent so that you can do projects and keep the lights on kind of approach? So I think you have to pick your battles a little bit and adjust your models and being mindful of it, right? And a company's culture can change quite dramatically by changing 3 or 4 leaders and then changing the model a little bit, right? Where maybe you didn't want to work there before, but now you are, from a culture or from a money standpoint. So I think they're all excellent points. So I would just add a little bit of adaptability based on the weather, and positioning. And then that'll change kind of, I think, where your mindset is a little bit.
And to, as this, memories come to play, one organization that I worked in, it was, they needed to turn the organization around. They needed to become more efficient. They needed to become more effective. And who did they had consultants, but they asked the employees in the organization, what can we do? What can we do to drive down costs? What can we do to streamline? What can we do to improve? And the employees had some excellent ideas. And they said what was feasible for them to do. What could we do initially? What can we do in 6 months? And so they put a whole graph together. And and I came in as that had gotten started. I came into the organization and then was able to continue that on in the area that I was working in. And we were really able to turn and made that like one of the most profitable manufacturing sites within that organization, and one of the most compliant from a government standpoint. So the people know what to do. They'll give you great ideas. Ask your people.
Well, I like this, and I want to, I wish for a purely devil's advocacy purposes, I wish there was like a CFO on this panel where we could be like, hey, here's why not to take the long-term view. Not to say you shouldn't take the long-term view, but I want to take another perspective at it because, let's say the board looks at this and they want to see more profitability, or I don't know. I mean, Dan, you bring up so many good and interesting points. I think one area that a lot of organizations get in trouble is when they take work that's project work, but they brand it as sustainable work. And that is something that I see a lot of organizations doing. And when we say project work, sometimes I'm directly talking about this is a specific project you're working on. But a lot of times what I'm talking about is an organization making a pivot. Maybe they say, hey, we want to enter into this new market, or we want to try this new way of doing something. It's an experiment, but they don't brand it as an experiment. They don't let the person who they've hired or they've repurposed into this role to run the experiment, let them know that it is in fact an experiment, and this is the timeline that we're going to be evaluating. These are the results we want to see. Oftentimes they don't do any of that. They just kind of say like, hey, we got this new experimental opportunity. You can get an increase in title. Do you want to jump on? And they're like, sure, yeah, I'll take on a VP role. That sounds great. And then, they get into it, not realizing that, it's a very fragile situation. And in 6, 9, 12 months, however much leash the organization is going to give them, they might cut bait and say, it didn't work out, didn't hit the numbers we wanted. We didn't tell you what numbers we wanted to hit, but you didn't hit them.
And that's where some of the younger people coming in with projects tied to ROI is a really strong play. Because you say, if I can do this project quicker, you're going to give me a 20% bump at the end of the project, right? Because I can show you this ROI. If there's a TCO attached to it or something like that, where the CFO has said, hey, I'm not willing to spend more than this because I'll never get this back. Otherwise, we got to cut loose that whole initiative or
Well, by
idea.
the way, we're just real quick. What's a TCO?
Total cost of ownership.
Okay,
So
sorry.
that's
Thank you. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
the most I'm willing to throw at this before we start just vacating people out, right? ROI, like if you're not getting on that return on investment by this time, this isn't a great idea. We got to shut it down, minimize it. The exposure is too high. But I think by that having those resources come in as a project, they're super aggressive to get that ROI because they get that bonus, that extra chunk, but it also pushes that company to be into that spot or to cut the risk, you know.
I worked in the C-suite in one company. I can't mention who they are because of what I'm about to say. But their COO and CFO were the same person. CFO became the COO and kept the CFO title. And I know there were a number of times that I had to present to him some budget numbers and some staffing numbers. And he nodded his head, yeah, that makes good sense. And then a week later, um, he announced, a reduction in force. And that reduction in force included lots of people, and I was rather surprised. And so I went up to him and I talked with him a little bit. And he said, well, that's the way it is. I need to make sure that our quarterly earnings call makes sense because if we keep all these people and our run rate doesn't go down to match what we can afford, then I'm going to lose my job and I don't want to lose my job. And so he just fired a whole bunch of people. It was terrible for morale. It was terrible for execution what we needed to do. And in my case, I was the CISO. So reduction in capability and security is nothing to sneeze at. But also in security, there is no ROI. People talk about the ROI of security. There's no such thing. There is no return on investment when you're spending for security. There's a return on risk reduction. There's a return on reliability, sustainability, and all the abilities, but there is no ROI. So the CFO looked at that and said, well, I don't need this. And that was the end of the discussion. In fact, there was no discussion.
Playing devil's advocate, because I love that story, but playing devil's advocate, what happens if the other is true? What happens if the other aspect is true where the CFO, COO say, you know what? We're going to hold on. We're going to keep everybody. We think the market's going to turn. We think our profitability is going to turn. We think things are going to move in the right direction. Let's hold. And they hold for 1 or 2 more quarters. And then all of a sudden they take it down to the point where they're like, oh my gosh, we're going to have to take out a loan or we're going to have to figure something out. And then it's an even wider scale layoff, even more than what the original layoff would have been, because the organization tanked. Not to say that I should be a or people should be a doomsday prepper, but like just
Right.
playing devil's advocate here, like where do we find that balance? And really, what can we do to achieve that balance and set expectations properly with everybody involved?
Well, one of the things that's going on today is that we see people, lots of people in top positions talking about the problem with looking at life in quarters. Because you've got these quarterly reports, especially for public companies, they've got to do their quarterly reports and they have their quarterly briefs and the investment calls and all that. So they can't afford, in their minds, to say, well, this quarter we're not going to meet expectations, or this quarter we're going to make less, or God forbid, we're going to lose some money. I mean, look what happened to some of the big tech when they did that. Their stock tanked, at least for the short term. And most CFOs don't want to be on the receiving end of that. So they'll make whatever cuts they need to, um, regardless of what it means for the ability of the company to execute on its mission.
Yeah, there is usually some methods around how long you can suffer though, right? Like if you don't have the cash flow at some point, you've got to get rid of a product line, you've got to do a divestiture of space, or stop doing things that are bleeding you out in a larger scale, right? I mean, once you're over that 20 to 30% operating loss, that's a tough to come back from, right? I
Hmm.
mean, you're severing a limb at that point. It gets pretty aggressive pretty quick. And I think that's where you have to see where your tolerance as a leader is how far are you willing to let that go before you're starting to talk about amputating, right? Because it gets rough at that point, right?
Let me jump in and do what Garrett has been doing and play devil's advocate. Um, since we're a consulting firm, we work with lots of companies, Global 2000, Fortune 500, and so on. And many of these people have more money in the bank than they know what to do with, and they still cut back because they want their quarterly reports to look good. They don't want to be drawing down from their bank account because that looks bad. They want to have a big fat bank account in reserve for when they need to do something big, like acquire a company or whatever it might be. So I think sometimes the amount they have in the bank is not enough to sway them away from cutting back.
Yeah, I've heard the term, it's our free cash flow. And we've got to make sure that we've got that free cash flow because they're measured on that now. And, I don't know that, Garrett, that we could say there's a definitive balance. I think, it seems to me that it's one of those things you have to feel your way through. And, I think of the story of Miller Hyman when they had to cut back and cut costs and this, a number of years back. And they did ask the employees and they got a lot of ideas from the employees and they implemented quite a few of them and they were able to hold it off. But one of the things that, the feedback is that they felt the employees, it wasn't something done to them. It was, we're all in this together. This is what we're all trying to get to. This is our focus. And I look at that and think, if you're really understanding, the employees know where we're headed, what we're trying to do, and the transparency, I think you've got a better advantage in, really making it through the storm and making it through tougher times.
Well, and this is really interesting because it makes me think of like organizations. I know, like, I think it was more recent, like Google and Microsoft shows profitability, still lays people off. And, you wonder, like, what is the ROI? What is the cost benefit analysis of that? And if I'm putting myself in the shoes of, let's say, the CFO of both of those respective companies, my logic is probably we might have some outdated business lines or business lines that are not showing to be as profitable or promising as others. And we'd rather retain the profitability and that cash to devote towards, in a lot of those cases, AI and give big fat $200 million a year salaries to, people to leave AI initiatives in their respective organizations. And so if you don't make that investment now, and if you don't retain that profitability to make those investments now, you could be left in the dust. And so this makes me think back to another point, Dan, you brought up about this concept of like building to weather the storm versus building for growth. And it's such an interesting concept because if you're at an organization that doesn't align with wherever you're at, you're kind of woefully out of place. And you can probably tell it. Like if you're built for growth and you're at an organization that's like, we're just here to hunker down, you're going to be like, my company sucks. We can't invest in anything. Nobody wants to move forward. It's just like hold and slow and stay still and like bureaucracy, baby. Like keep it everything copacetic. At the flip side, if you're built for weathering the storm and just like hunkering down for the winter time and the organization's like, grow, 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 like get out there, make it happen, you're going to be stressed out, anxiety filled, and probably not feeling very comfortable in the organization. I guess so the question is when organizations oscillate between high growth or weathering storm, how often do you find people can move with that? And like, have you seen people
Yeah.
go from like great weather the storm people to great growth people, or vice versa?
This year alone in the education, it's been pretty chaotic. We had a president come in and get rid of education funding, right, in the first couple months of this year. And so we were looking at not making payroll by the summer. We were looking at a $30 million loss.
Wow.
So we had to pivot and change and go into fundraising. Now we're 52 million out of a 70 million plan. So now we've swung it 20 million the other direction. State funding has come in, but we still had to shift what people were doing and what their purpose was. By adding that clarity and going, we need you to find money versus we need you to manage money appropriately, right? We need to shift what your focus is, or we don't make payroll, you know, in 6 months, right? Having that little bit of a runway, but also shift your focus. And we were able to raise money versus spending money for purpose, right? Then we can come back to growing for purpose using the allocations as appropriate. But we had to move because we still wanted to grow, but we needed to grow differently. And I think the more you can bring people into the center and refocus them and then shift your teams around, they didn't get laid off, but their roles changed. And you can say, yeah, I completely understand why, right? There's not money coming in this way. We need money to come in this other way. So you got to get on this other product line, right? And so I think it comes back to, a point Suzanne made too earlier, and that's just kind of bringing people in. They have great ideas. They know how to be successful. You just need to empower them a little bit and give them healthy boundaries and good direction versus only talking to them when you want more out of them, or did they meet performance? If not, fire them. Instead of cutting it into more of a mechanism, bring them back into the seat a little bit and go, how do you get us to return on this investment of you? And then they should do the opposite. How are you investing in me for me giving you this return in the business? There should be a little bit of a play there.
Michael, what do you think about that? Like, what, in your experience, what has been the propensity for people oscillate between weathering the storm mentality and high growth mentality. Now, Dan, your example is super interesting because it was such a rapid swing. I feel like most organizations is way slower. It's kind of like, oh, we're gradually going from growth mode
And
to
education is usually really slow.
yeah.
Yeah.
So that's a very interesting, like I could see it being more understandable if the swing went from like weather the storm to like high growth because people go to a state of emergency for a temporary period of time, but they typically won't live there. So it seemed like they didn't need to live there, so they could go back into weathering the storm, keeping everything copacetic mode. But I think for most organizations, it's pretty gradual in terms of the oscillations. But I don't know. Suzanne, Michael, what do you think?
Usually it's some disruption that causes that swing. Just in, part of my background is pharmaceutical, and in the manufacturing side, there was I'll just say a significant plant that wasn't going to be able to produce some products that were needed. And the FDA came to the organization in the site where I was and asked us and said, can you take this on? And that was a significant, okay, we've got to incorporate this into our lines and our flow, but we're going to need more people. And we were a 5 days a week, 3-shift operation. We had to go to weekend shifts in order to produce. And so that was something that we had to ramp up quick. We had to hire people for, we had to train people for. And we certainly needed those senior technicians and folks within the business that could ramp up. And we explained, what we needed, what needed to happen. And I mean, they went after it. And there was even, new lines brought in for, manufacturing and producing. And we had people, I remember several of the technicians stepping up saying, I want to do that. I want to figure that out. And they certainly did and did it well. So, you rally them around that cause, and they want to contribute. And it was very successful. And then you want to sustain that.
I want to bring in the whole economy issue again. You look at people who have stable jobs, but they see people around them getting laid off. People in the same company, people in similar companies, and they tend to get nervous and they say, well, I seem to be stable and okay, but I better start looking around in case I can find something better that's got better long-term potential. So one of the, I guess, not side benefits, side deficits of laying people off in order to keep your budget in place is that you're going to make people nervous. And who's going to leave? Your top performers, because they can get other jobs. So the top performers will move to other companies. You'll be left with, I'll call it a lower level of performance by the remaining employees. And that starts a whole cycle. So in this economy, people don't want to people don't want to wait to lose their job, because if you lose your job, it's really hard to get another one. But if you've got a job, then it's a little easier to get another one. So that's a downside.
Yeah, that's interesting. Y'all are touching on this really interesting point. Y'all haven't said this explicitly, but it seems like this is the point that's being touched on here is regardless of whether or not we're in a weather the storm organization or we're in a growth organization or if we're in that state of the business because of the economy or whatever it may be, it sounds like what you're saying is that the role of clear communication and expectations is critical. Like from the example, Michael, you gave where you spoke with your CFO, COO person at your previous organization, and he said, oh, everything looks good. We should hire these people. Makes sense. And the very next week lays everybody off. Or, Dan and Suzanne's in the examples you've given as well, where it's like when it doesn't go well is when we're not communicating what is going on. And so I guess the question I have is, what are the contributing factors for why organizations struggle to effectively communicate the reality of their situations and the ramifications they may have on those individuals working in those roles?
I think one simplicity is that most people don't know the value that they bring and how it impacts the bottom line. I don't think that a lot of organizations are very clear on revenue to person value as some sort of metric, right? Each department's going to be different, will weigh differently, sure. But most organizations I find that people don't know how much revenue and profit, and they don't know where their value is in that table. So they're uncomfortable asking, hey, is my role bringing value? Right? They'd rather kind of hide back and say, is it a sustainable role? It's only sustainable if what you do adds money or creates value of some sort. So I think that's one thing is just good business knowledge being communicated from financial to the talent level of where the value is for these different roles, because that's what you're going to invest in and that's when you're going to depart from, right? Depending on where the spectrum is. Right. And then there's going to be tolerance in the middle. I'm sure Suzanne has a better look from a talent, I would hope, perspective.
Oh, well, and I'm thinking, certainly when businesses are having to transform or they're having to shift or they're having to be adaptable, one of the things that organizations tend to do is that we're going to give you the data behind it. We're going to give you the logic behind why we're doing what we're doing. The other piece of that many times is missing in that communication is there's an emotional aspect to it as well. And there is why we're doing what we're doing. We need to give you the space and help you move through this change. How is it impacting you? How much disruption is it causing? How much resistance? What's the time to go through it? And everybody moves through that differently because usually there's not just one thing happening that is changing. There's multiple things. And it's also, let's help you feel safe as we move through that. Also, there's different roles in the organization. How do we each help each other? And, I'll share, Dr. Britt Andriata has done a lot of work around this and change and leading change. And, I credit her and learning from her as to you've got to take both aspects into account when you're going through these more challenging times.
One of the things I've noticed that I mean, in some ways it surprises me, in some ways it doesn't. But public companies have these quarterly earnings calls. Um, what percentage of employees actually participate in those, listen to those, or even know they're going on? Um, and I think that's a very low number. Now, employees should care about these calls because that gives them a heads up as to how well are things going. What is the president of the company or the CFO, whoever's presenting, what are they saying about the future of the company? What are they saying about growth, prosperity, or the other? Um, and how is that going to affect me? And what can I do to affect it? But the percentage of people who actually pay attention to that is shockingly low. Have you seen the same?
It's
Well,
only going to be companies with profit share programs, right? Your Kroger's and people like that are going to get $200 a quarter because they've been buying into the profitability of the company quarterly, right? Those people will care.
I would even take it one step further, Michael. I mean, I've known companies where they do open book management, where they'll openly publish the books to everybody in the organization. But Dan, to your point, most people don't contextually know what that means. It's just a bunch of financial mumbo jumbo. So, like for them, it's like numbers and this, that. There's EBITDA here. There's, net profit over here. This is gross margin, net margin. Why are these numbers different? I don't know. And then, ultimately at the end of the day, an employee wants to know, am I going to get my bonus at the end of the year or am I not? And to your point, Dan, earlier, of most people don't understand how their role leads to the profitability of the business. I think that's really, really critical. And from Michael, for some of the points you're bringing up, especially for like cybersecurity or for roles where it's like there's not where it's not like an accounting firm or a law firm where they're direct like billed hourly type of thing where I can directly say my hour booked here generated this much revenue for the business. You paid me this much less. That's margin for the business. That's very clear ROI. I guess where I'm going within all of this is as employees, as managers, as leaders, we need to be able to effectively quantify the value we bring to the organization if they don't do it for us. And therefore, we need to be able to better understand, like, cool, especially like if you're in cybersecurity, you're not a revenue center, but you need to know what percentage of these types of businesses get hacked and what's the cost of those hacks. Because if we can say, cool, a typical business within our space gets hacked once every 6 months, and the cost of every hack is around $5 million. Well, great. You're paying me XYZ dollar a year less than that, and we haven't been hacked once in the last 3 years. Sounds like a good trade-off to me. But I mean, I would imagine you have to do more of those proactive kind of ROI settings, because if you don't, you know, we've had some, some good quarters. Things are going well. We haven't been hacked in like years. Do we need to have somebody in cybersecurity? I mean, let's, like maybe we can just come on in as like a uh-oh basis and only bring you in if an uh-oh happens. Well, when an
Well,
uh-oh,
Yeah, there's a value
I,
of relevance too. That's why a lot of people are doing AI just to say they're relevant in the space or in the market too. So that has a value to the board and to the company as well, is saying that you're relevant, right?
One area that I've encouraged, that I do myself and encourage my teams to do, is looking at, okay, what cost did we avoid and what cost did we save? And, looking at those costs, because, we're an indirect cost in the business, but what value we can bring value that way, as well as looking at, how do we lower attrition? How do we increase retention? We look at some of those other numbers, and that's where we can demonstrate the value we bring to the organization.
I love it. Great. This has been a great conversation. Suzanne, Dan, Michael, this has been a great pre-symposium panel. If you're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, I want to meet these three great leaders, come to our executive symposium, October 7th. We're hosting it at the Houston Dynamo headquarters. So right near like Shell Energy Stadium in downtown Houston, October 7th, 5 to 8 p.m. I'd love to see you there. I'll post in the link, the RSVP to come on out. But anyways, thank you all for being here. This was a great pre-symposium panel. I look forward to seeing you on the 7th.